The lobby of the Grandmont Hotel blazed with afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric patterns across marble floors that probably cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. Dr. Diane Patterson stood near the concierge desk in a tailored navy blazer and crisp white blouse, her leather briefcase at her feet, waiting for the front desk manager to locate her reservation. She'd been standing there for 4 minutes, watching three white guests get checked in ahead of her, despite arriving after she did. The exhaustion from the red-eye flight from Washington, D.C. pressed against her temples, but she kept her expression neutral and professional. She was used to waiting, used to being overlooked, and used to the particular kind of invisibility that came with being a black woman in spaces designed for everyone but you. What she wasn't used to, what she would never accept, was the heavy hand that suddenly gripped her upper arm from behind. The hand belonged to a security guard whose name tag read Richard Bauer, a white man in his early 40s with a buzz cut and the kind of swagger that suggested he enjoyed the small amount of authority his uniform provided. His fingers dug into her arm hard enough to leave marks. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me immediately." His voice was loud enough to turn heads across the lobby. Diane turned slowly, her eyes meeting his with the kind of calm that comes from years of facing down organized crime bosses and terrorist cells. "Excuse me?" Bauer's grip tightened. "We've received complaints that you're harassing our guests. I need you to leave the premises right now or I'll have you arrested for trespassing." If that opening made your blood pressure spike, if you felt that familiar burn of injustice in your chest, then you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that like button because this story takes a turn that will restore your faith in consequences. Share this with someone who needs to see what happens when prejudice meets power, when assumptions collide with reality, when a bully picks the absolute wrong person to target. And subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories about moments that matter, about justice that arrives when you least expect it, about people who refuse to be diminished no matter how hard the world tries to shrink them. Now let me take you back to understand who Dr. Diane Patterson really was, because the man gripping her arm had no idea he was manhandling one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the United States, and the next 60 seconds would change his life forever. Diane Patterson had spent 26 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She'd started as a field agent in the Chicago office fresh out of Yale Law School, working organized crime cases in neighborhoods where her skin color was an asset instead of a liability, where she could blend in and gather intelligence that her white colleagues never could. She'd built cases against the outfit's remaining operations, against drug trafficking organizations that moved product worth millions through the city's south and west sides, against corrupt politicians who'd forgotten that public service meant serving the public. She was brilliant at the work, meticulous and patient, the kind of investigator who could connect dots that looked like random splatter to everyone else. Her conviction rate was legendary. Defense attorneys groaned when they saw her name on the witness list. 15 years into her career, she'd been promoted to special agent in charge of the Chicago field office. 5 years after that, she'd been appointed assistant director of the Criminal Investigative Division at headquarters in D.C. And 2 years ago, after a career that included dismantling 3 major terrorist cells, taking down a Supreme Court justice involved in a bribery scheme, and personally interrogating some of the most dangerous criminals in America, she'd been confirmed as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the first black woman to ever hold the position, the person responsible for 35,000 employees and a budget that ran into the billions. She'd flown into Chicago that morning for a conference on domestic terrorism, scheduled to deliver the keynote address in 3 hours at a convention center 2 blocks from this hotel. Her detail of 6 FBI agents was checking the conference venue and would meet her at the hotel at 4 p.m. She'd wanted these 2 hours alone, a brief window to check into her room, take a shower, review her speech notes in peace. She'd specifically chosen the Grandmont because she'd stayed here a dozen times when she ran the Chicago office, back when the staff knew her name and the general manager always sent up a bottle of wine to welcome her. That was 8 years ago. The hotel had changed ownership twice since then. New management, new staff, new security guard who was currently forcing her toward the exit while she kept her voice low and controlled. "Sir, you're making a mistake." I have a reservation. I'm a guest at this hotel. If you'll just give me a moment to show you my confirmation." Bauer cut her off, his voice dripping with contempt. "I don't care what story you're selling. We know your type. You come into these nice hotels, pretend you belong, try to steal from the rooms or scam the guests. I've worked security for 15 years, and I can spot a fraud from across the lobby. Now you can walk out on your own, or I can drag you out. Your choice." The lobby had gone quiet. Other guests were staring now, some with their phones out, recording. Diane felt the familiar calculation running through her mind, the same one she'd been making her entire life. Option 1, escalate, make a scene, demand to speak to management, pull out her FBI credentials and watch this man's face drain of color when he realized exactly who he was manhandling. Option 2, de-escalate, comply, void the viral video of an FBI director being dragged through a hotel lobby, even though every cell in her body screamed against rewarding this man's behavior with compliance. She was weighing these options when Bauer made the decision for her. He twisted her arm behind her back, the same control hold she'd been trained to use on suspects, and started physically pushing her toward the revolving doors. The pain shot up her shoulder. Her briefcase fell from her other hand, spilling papers across the marble floor. And something inside Diane shifted from professional calculation to cold fury. "You're assaulting me," she said clearly, loud enough for every phone camera to catch it. "I am a guest at this hotel with a confirmed reservation. You are committing battery. Remove your hands from me immediately." Bauer laughed, actually laughed, as he shoved her harder toward the exit. "Assault, lady? I'm doing my job. You're trespassing. And if you don't shut your mouth, I'll add resisting and disorderly conduct to the charges." They were 10 feet from the revolving doors when the front desk manager finally looked up from her computer, finally registered what was happening in her lobby. Her name tag read Susan Chen, and her expression shifted from distracted to alarmed as she called out, "Richard, wait, what's going on?" Bauer didn't stop moving. "Got a trespasser, Susan. Already called the cops. They'll be here in a 5 to take her in." Susan hurried around the desk, her heels clicking urgently across the marble. "But Richard, you can't just... Did you verify she's not a guest?" He rolled his eyes. "Look at her. Does she look like she belongs at the Grandmont? Use your head." Susan's face flushed. "That's not... We need to check the reservation system before you remove anyone. This could be a lawsuit waiting to happen." Bauer had stopped moving now, still gripping Diane's arm, clearly annoyed at this interruption to his power trip. "Fine, what name?" Diane spoke before Susan could ask, her voice level despite the pain radiating through her shoulder. "Dr. Diane Patterson, reservation confirmation number, Hotel Charlie, 73926. Susan pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen as she accessed the hotel system. Her expression changed as she read the details. "Oh my God, Richard, she's telling the truth. Presidential suite, reserved and prepaid. VIP status in the system with a note that says, 'Oh no.'" She looked up at Diane with horror spreading across her face. The note says federal government official, high security clearance to arrange private check-in. Bauer's grip loosened slightly but didn't release. So she scammed her way into a reservation. Probably using a stolen credit card. Happens all the time. Diane had reached the end of her patience. She turned her head to look directly at the camera phone being held by a young woman in yoga pants standing 15 feet away. "My name is Dr. Diane Patterson. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This man is currently committing assault and battery against a federal official. This entire incident is being documented. I am requesting that someone call the Chicago Police Department and ask for Captain Maria Santos. Tell her Director Patterson needs assistance at the Grandmont Hotel." The lobby went completely silent. Bauer's hand dropped from her arm like she'd suddenly become electrified. Susan Chen's face had gone pale. The guest with the phone camera gasped audibly. And in the corner of the lobby, a man in a dark suit who'd been reading a newspaper lowered it slowly, revealing the earpiece and the subtle bulge of a concealed weapon. He was followed by 5 others, all emerging from different positions around the lobby, all moving toward Diane with the coordinated precision of a protection detail. Her lead agent, a man named Marcus Webb, who'd been with her detail for 3 years, reached her first. Director Patterson, are you all right? We saw what happened on the security feed. Local PD is already on their way. Diane rubbed her shoulder where Bauer's fingers had dug in, feeling the tenderness that would definitely bruise. I'm fine, Marcus. Although I think Mr. Bauer and I need to have a conversation about federal law, specifically Title 18, Section 1114, which makes it a felony to assault a federal officer engaged in official duties. Bauer had backed up 3 steps, his face cycling through expressions like a slot machine. Disbelief, fear, denial, more fear. There's no way you're the FBI director. This is some kind of scam. You don't look like... He stopped himself, but everyone in the lobby heard the unfinished sentence. You don't look like what you claim to be. You don't look like someone with power. You don't look like you belong here. Diane had heard variations of that statement her entire career. She'd heard it from criminals who underestimated her in interrogation rooms, from colleagues who questioned whether diversity initiatives had put her in positions she hadn't earned, from senators during her confirmation hearing who couldn't seem to believe that a black woman from the south side of Chicago could rise to lead the nation's premier law enforcement agency. She was tired of hearing it. Marcus pulled out his credentials, the official FBI identification that included his photo and the designation, Special Agent Director's Protective Detail. He held it up for Bauer to see. Sir, I'm going to need you to step back and remain where you are. You've just committed a federal offense. Do not attempt to leave the premises. Susan Chen had her hand over her mouth, tears actually forming in her eyes as the magnitude of the situation crashed over her. Director Patterson, I am so incredibly sorry. This should never have happened. There's no excuse for this. Please let me get the general manager down here immediately. Diane straightened her blazer, her movements deliberately calm despite the adrenaline still pumping through her system. Yes, I'd like to speak with whoever's in charge, and I'd like the security footage from the past 15 minutes preserved immediately. This footage will be part of a federal investigation. Susan was already dialing, her hands shaking. Bauer seemed to be catching up to reality, his face now showing panic. Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job. Someone called and said there was a suspicious person in the lobby. I was responding to a complaint. You can't arrest me for that. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Who called in the complaint? Bauer hesitated. It was anonymous. Someone from the front desk area said there was a problem. Susan looked up from her phone call, confused. Richard, no one from the front desk called you. I've been here the whole shift. Where did you really get this complaint? The silence that followed was damning, because everyone in the lobby was starting to understand what had really happened. There had been no complaint, no call, no legitimate reason for Bauer to approach Diane at all, much less put his hands on her. He'd seen a black woman standing in an upscale hotel lobby and decided she didn't belong. His bias had written a story in his head, and he'd acted on it without a single shred of evidence beyond the color of her skin. The Chicago police arrived 7 minutes later, led by Captain Maria Santos, a woman who'd worked with Diane a decade ago when they'd jointly taken down a human trafficking ring operating out of O'Hare Airport. Maria took one look at the scene, at Diane rubbing her shoulder, at Bauer standing in the corner looking like he wanted to disappear into the marble floor, and her expression hardened. Director Patterson, I heard what happened. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention? Diane shook her head. I'm fine, Maria. Sore, but fine. I need this incident documented. Official police report. Witness statements from everyone who saw what happened. And I need Mr. Bauer arrested for assault and battery on a federal official. Bauer's knees actually buckled. No, please, you can't. I made a mistake. I'm sorry, I didn't know who you were. Diane turned to face him fully for the first time since her detail had arrived. That's the problem, Mr. Bauer. You didn't know who I was, so you made assumptions. You saw my skin color and decided I was a criminal. You didn't ask for my name, didn't verify any facts, didn't request identification. You just grabbed me and tried to throw me out because, in your mind, someone who looks like me couldn't possibly be a legitimate guest at a nice hotel. Her voice was quiet but carried across the lobby. How many other people have you done this to? How many other black guests have you harassed and removed from this hotel based on nothing but a man in his 50s named Harold Westbrook, who looked like he was about to have a coronary as the situation was explained to him. He started with apologies, profuse and panicked, the kind that come from watching a lawsuit materialize in real time. He offered complimentary rooms, refunded reservations, personal assurances that this would never happen again. Diane listened with the expression she used in budget hearings when senators tried to justify cutting FBI funding, polite but unmoved. Mr. Westbrook, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't about a free room upgrade. This is about the culture of your establishment that allowed this incident to occur. Your security guard felt empowered to physically assault a guest based solely on racial profiling. That suggests a systemic problem, not a one-time mistake. Westbrook assured her he would launch a full investigation, that Bauer would be terminated immediately, that new training protocols would be implemented. Diane nodded but said nothing. She'd heard these promises before, seen how quickly they evaporated once the cameras stopped rolling and the outrage faded. Real change required more than promises. It required accountability, which is why she'd already decided how this would proceed. Mr. Westbrook, here's what's going to happen. The FBI's Civil Rights Division will be conducting an investigation into potential violations of federal law at this hotel. We'll be reviewing your hiring practices, your training materials, your incident reports for the past 5 years, and interviewing your staff and former guests. If we find a pattern of discriminatory behavior, this establishment will face federal charges. Do you understand? Westbrook's face went from red to white. Yes, Director Patterson. Absolutely. We'll cooperate fully. Diane spent the next hour giving her statement to Captain Santos, while her detail collected witness information from the dozen guests who'd watched the incident unfold. The young woman with the yoga pants and the phone camera turned out to be a law student named Jennifer, who'd captured the entire confrontation from the moment Bauer first grabbed Diane's arm. I knew it was wrong, Jennifer said, her voice shaking slightly as she gave her statement. The way he grabbed her, the things he said. I could tell she was just trying to check in like everyone else. I'm so sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I should have intervened. Diane thanked her for the video, which would serve as irrefutable evidence, and told her something she'd learned over 26 years in law enforcement. Bearing witness is a form of intervention, documentation is a form of justice, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is make sure the truth gets recorded. Richard Bauer was arrested and charged with battery, federal official, a felony carrying up to 8 years in prison. As officers led him out of the lobby in handcuffs, he was crying, begging for another chance, saying he had a wife and kids and couldn't go to prison. Diane watched him go and felt no satisfaction, only a weary sadness that it had come to this, that a man had to face federal charges to understand that black people deserve basic human dignity, that it took an FBI director being assaulted for anyone to care about a complaint that hundreds of other black guests had probably made over the years without consequence. She never did make it to her hotel room. By the time the statements were finished and the initial investigation wrapped up, it was 3:30 p.m. and she needed to be at the convention center in 30 minutes. She freshened up in the hotel's presidential suite bathroom, changed into the spare blouse she always kept in her briefcase for emergencies, and let her detail drive her the 2 blocks to the conference. Her shoulder was throbbing and she'd definitely have bruises, but she'd given speeches under worse conditions. She'd once delivered congressional testimony 12 hours after being in a car accident that totaled her vehicle. She'd interrogated a domestic terrorist 6 hours after her father's funeral. Pain was just information. You acknowledged it and kept moving. The conference was packed with law enforcement officials from across the country. Over 2,000 people gathered to discuss emerging threats and coordinate responses. When Diane walked onto the stage to deliver her keynote, the standing ovation that greeted her was thunderous. News of the hotel incident had already spread through law enforcement circles. The video was trending on social media, and everyone in that room understood exactly what she'd just endured. She waited for the applause to die down, then began her prepared remarks about domestic terrorism and the evolving threat landscape. But 15 minutes into the speech, she went off script. This morning, I experienced something that millions of Americans experience every day. I was profiled, harassed, and physically assaulted because someone looked at my skin color and decided I was a criminal. The only difference between my experience and countless others is that I had the power to demand accountability. I had a badge and a title and a protective detail. Most people don't. She told them about standing in that lobby, being grabbed and manhandled, hearing the security guard's contempt in his voice when he called her your type. She told them about the calculation she'd had to make in real time, the weight of knowing that any response she chose would be scrutinized and judged and used as evidence of something beyond the simple fact that she was a person being wronged. We talk about implicit bias training and procedural justice reforms, she said, her voice carrying to the back of the convention hall. But until we acknowledge that racism isn't just about individual bad actors like Richard Bauer, until we understand that it's embedded in systems and assumptions and the casual certainty that someone like me doesn't belong in spaces of power and privilege, we'll keep having these incidents. We'll keep seeing Black people arrested for sitting in Starbucks, shopping at Nordstrom, moving into their own apartments, standing in their own hotel lobbies. Because the problem isn't just the Richard Bauers of the world. It's the system that hired him without adequate training, the culture that emboldened him to act on his biases, and the broader society that taught him those biases in the first place. The hall was silent now, the kind of attention that comes from people hearing something they need to hear, even if it makes them uncomfortable. I'm the director of the FBI. I have resources and power that most people will never have. And even I couldn't avoid being treated like a criminal in broad daylight in a hotel lobby. Think about what that means for everyone who doesn't have a badge. Think about what it means for the single mother trying to afford a hotel room for her kids, for the college student checking in for an interview, for every Black person who has to carry their receipts and confirmations and proof of belonging just to exist in public spaces without being harassed. She wrapped up the speech 20 minutes later to another standing ovation, but she could see faces in the crowd that looked troubled, thoughtful, wrestling with implications they hadn't fully considered before. Good. Discomfort was the beginning of change. After the keynote, Diane spent 3 hours in closed-door meetings with the Attorney General and several U.S. attorneys, coordinating the federal investigation into the Grandmont Hotel and discussing whether the incident revealed broader patterns worth investigating across the national chain. The hotel's corporate office had already reached out through back channels, offering settlement discussions. But Diane shut that down immediately. This wasn't about money. This was about establishing precedent. This was about sending a message that you couldn't discriminate your way out of consequences by writing a check. By the time she made it back to FBI headquarters in Washington that evening, her shoulder had swollen enough that her chief of staff insisted she see the Bureau's medical unit. They confirmed severe bruising and soft tissue damage, prescribed anti-inflammatories, and recommended she file a workers' compensation claim since the assault happened during official travel. Diane did the paperwork mechanically, her mind already on the bigger picture. The Civil Rights Division's investigation would take months, but she'd personally oversee it. She wanted to know how many other guests had complained about discriminatory treatment at Grandmont properties. She wanted hiring records and training materials. She wanted to map every incident report filed by security at every property in the chain. The media coverage was intense and immediate. By the next morning, the video from Jennifer's phone had been viewed 18 million times. Cable news ran the story on loop, bringing in experts to discuss implicit bias and racial profiling. Social media exploded with people sharing their own experiences of being harassed or removed from hotels, stores, restaurants, while simply trying to exist. The hashtag that emerged was Black and Belonging, and within 48 hours there were over 2 million posts. People shared photos of themselves in professional settings with captions about all the times they'd been assumed to be staff instead of guests, criminals instead of customers, problems instead of people. Diane read through hundreds of these stories late one night, sitting in her office overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue. A doctor who'd been accused of stealing scrubs from her own hospital. A lawyer escorted out of a courthouse where he was scheduled to argue a case. A professor questioned about why she was in her own classroom. Each story was its own small violence, its own reminder that competence and achievement and humanity weren't always enough protection against the assumptions people made based on skin color. Richard Bauer's case moved through the system with unusual speed, partly because the evidence was overwhelming, and partly because having the FBI director as the victim of your crime focused attention wonderfully. His defense attorney tried to argue diminished capacity due to inadequate training, but the video showed Bauer's actions were deliberate and aggressive. He pleaded guilty to avoid trial and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, plus 3 years supervised release. His law enforcement career was over. His security license was revoked, and his name would forever be associated with the kind of racist brutality that the country was supposedly moving beyond. The Grandmont Hotel's investigation revealed what Diane had suspected. Bauer wasn't an outlier. He was a product of a culture that had quietly but consistently discouraged Black guests through 1,000 small hostile acts. The FBI's review found documented incidents of Black guests being assigned rooms near ice machines and elevators, the worst rooms in the property. Black guests being asked for additional forms of ID that white guests weren't required to provide. Black guests having the police called on them for minor complaints that were handled internally when white guests were involved. The pattern was undeniable and damning. The corporate office tried damage control, firing the regional managers and instituting new protocols, but the Department of Justice filed civil rights charges anyway. The case was settled 8 months later with a $40 million agreement that included mandatory bias training, independent monitoring of guest complaints for 5 years, and a fund to compensate the over 300 guests who'd filed discrimination complaints that the hotel had previously ignored. Diane attended the settlement announcement personally, standing beside the Attorney General as they detailed the agreement. She thought about all those guests who tried to speak up and been dismissed, who'd been told they were being too sensitive or misinterpreting innocent actions. They'd been right. They'd seen what was happening. And now, finally, someone with power had listened. The young law student Jennifer was there too, having become something of an activist after her video went viral. She'd started an organization documenting discriminatory incidents in public accommodations, creating a database that lawyers could use to prove patterns in civil rights cases. Diane had written her a letter of recommendation for law school that resulted in a full scholarship to Georgetown. Sometimes bearing witness didn't just document injustice. Sometimes it sparked the person who would help dismantle it. 6 months after the incident, Diane was invited to speak at a symposium on equality in public accommodations. She almost declined. The story had been told and retold so many times that she was tired of being the face of the conversation. But then she received a letter from a woman named Claire who'd been working at the Grandmont as a housekeeper during the incident. Claire was Black, had worked there for 11 years, and had her own stories about the culture Bauer had thrived in. She wrote that seeing Diane refuse to be diminished had given her the courage to file her own EECC complaint about the discrimination she'd faced as an employee. That complaint had revealed wage disparities, harassment, and a hostile work environment that affected dozens of Black and Latino workers at the hotel.